In the spring of 1944, the world awaits the attack of the Allied forces in Northern Europe, the opening of the much-awaited Second Front. In Italy, an earlier attempt at a second front has halted against fierce German resistance. In Russia, the Germans have fought their last offensive, an attack that crashes to failure at the Battle of Kursk. The end of the blitzkrieg as a menace is mirrored by the end of the German U-boat threat, as the German Navy is defeated in the Battle of the Atlantic. As the endgame begins, the Axis leadership can now only act to postpone its inevitable doom. The previous autumn, the Italian advance of the Allies had stopped before the town and hill of Monte Cassino. In the spring of 1944, 4 battles were to be fought in an attempt to take the town that dominated the front and prevented any move north. First, U.S. forces were repelled at high cost by the Germans. Then Indian and New Zealand troops, assisted by heavy strategic bombers, made 2 attempts to take Cassino, both times defeated with heavy losses. By the April of 1944, the Italian campaign had reached crisis. The success of the Germans was giving Hitler hope. The battles seemed to prove that German arms could deny both the greater numbers and material strength of the Allies. Both American and British generals admitted themselves bereft of ideas. The position was finally prized open by fresh minds. Free French troops drawn from Moroccan hill tribes found ways through mountains thought impassable and encircled Cassino. Free Polish troops made a near-suicidal attack from the south. Cassino fell, and the Italian front opened for movement. In the release from the frustration that the fight for Cassino had generated, clear military judgment became clouded by ambition and lust for glory. As the Germans retreated from Cassino, American armies could have overtaken and encircled their enemy, perhaps ending the war in Italy. Instead, U.S. General Mark Clark, an officer who felt the failure at Cassino personally and suspected the British of attempting to steal the glory of victory, ordered an advance on Rome, and the Germans fled northwards in safety. On June 4th, American forces entered Rome in triumph. Meanwhile, German engineers were preparing a new complex line of fortifications against which the battle would have to be fought all over again. Soon, the glory of the capture of the Italian capital would be overshadowed by greater events. As Cassino fell, in the Pacific, U.S. forces for the first time occupied Japanese territory. The Marshall Islands were a remote group of 36 Micronesian atolls forming part of the outer perimeter of Japanese defenses. In a brilliantly planned and executed attack which used intelligence derived from broken coded signals, which enabled the U.S. forces to find the weakest points in the Japanese fortifications, the islands were taken over by 80,000 troops. In the spring of 1944, fighting continued in the struggle along the borders of Burma, India, and China. British Empire forces were on the defensive against renewed Japanese attacks. Based on the adage that attack is the best form of defense, the Japanese had mounted an offensive to preempt a British and U.S. invasion. 85,000 Japanese troops attempted to take the remote towns of Impal and Kohima, towns that were effective gateways into India. The British Empire troops were ordered to resist, with no retreat or surrender, and Imphal and Kohima were besieged. The British supplied their troops by air, the Japanese not at all, and their troops began to suffer from starvation and disease. The British troops defied Japanese attack after Japanese attack for 80 days, with increasing desperation on both sides. In late June, the Japanese were forced to withdraw. Only a quarter of their troops had survived. The British began preparations to pursue their enemy. For nearly 4 years, Western Europe had suffered German occupation. However, it was clear to the world that this era of history was ending. All over southern England, the signs were that the invasion was coming. A massive assembly of men and material was gathering. The Allies aimed to bring an overwhelming strength to bear against the Germans. The invasion was given a secret codename, Operation Overlord. The coast of Britain, to a depth of 16 kilometers, became a secret forbidden military zone. Villages evacuated of civilians, countryside and coast requisitioned by the military, as armed forces practiced and practiced again the skills of amphibious warfare. Britain itself was sealed, all foreign travel forbidden. The invasion was the product of lessons learned in many previous operations, where the armies, air forces, and navies of different nations cooperated in detailed, coordinated action. At the top of the organization was United States General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower's abilities were political as much as military, making the alliance work in everyday reality. If it is true that every battle is won or lost before it's fought, then the leadership and the staff that Eisenhower assembled is the embodiment of that idea. There was meticulous attention to detail and a refusal to act without the correct preparation and resources for victory. The actual military plans were in the hands of Bernard Montgomery, the master of the set-piece battle, with a fanatical obsession for detail. Eisenhower's diplomacy was crucial in his winning command of both British and American strategic bomber air forces. The Air Force commanders believed their attacks on German industry and cities could win the war on their own, and resisted their planes being used in the support of ground forces. Events would show Eisenhower right. It's hard for us to realize that armies fighting on beaches, fighting their way ashore with specialist equipment, was a new thing. Historically, amphibious landings were made by ordinary ships, ordinary boats, by small armies. The size of armies, the lack of radar, of aircraft, of the telephone, meant amphibious landings were made unopposed. The lessons of previous invasions in North Africa and Italy brought forth new technologies of war. Swimming tanks were designed to fight with the very first wave of attacks. Provided with flotation tanks and propellers, the tanks were launched at sea and swam ashore to suppress fire from defending infantry. Specialist fighting vehicles cleared mines, laid roads, and bridged obstacles. It was an eccentric area in which the British excelled. The Allies' preparations and rehearsals, though, could not be hidden. It was not hard for the Germans to guess which beaches could be targeted for landing. It was obvious that the invasion would be mounted within the range of fighter cover from planes flying from England. It was not difficult to determine when time, tide, and weather would be right. Two broad strategic options lay open to the Allies. First, to attack across the English Channel at its narrowest, to land near Calais. This would be an obvious move. Once established, Allied forces would have a short thrust into southern Germany. The alternative would be to attack in Normandy, further to the west. The Allied forces mounted a complex campaign of deception aimed at fooling the Germans into thinking that an invasion was to fall on Calais, when in fact the attack was to be made in Normandy. A phony military formation was created, the 1st U.S. Army Group. This imaginary unit was based opposite Calais. The Germans were able to listen in to signals passed between fictional units. Vast arsenals of weaponry could be spied by German reconnaissance, inflatable tanks, and dummy aircraft. All Germany's spies in Britain had been caught and turned, and were feeding fake intelligence to their spy masters. Air power was central to the success of Overlord. In the Italian campaign at Salerno and Anzio, well-organized German troops had quickly brought up reserves against Allied amphibious landings. The first days and weeks of the invasion would be a race between the two armies to bring reinforcements into action. Air power was crucial to the Allies winning that race, attacking the roads, the railways, and the bridges the German army would use. In April and May 1944, more than 11,000 aircraft of all types flew 200,000 sorties against targets in France. Communications, airfields, military bases, coastal guns, and radar stations. The railway system of northern France was almost entirely destroyed. The air forces were important in the deception, too. 3 times as many bombs were dropped in the east aimed at the Calais region as were dropped near to the true Normandy target. The Luftwaffe was entirely overwhelmed. It had a mere 300 aircraft to match 11,000 of the Allies. The disruption wrought by the Allied air forces was complemented by the actions of the French resistance. The armed resistance, the Maquis, was not strong enough to take on the German army, but through acts of sabotage and diversionary attacks, they disrupted German communications, preventing the rapid reaction that could have halted the invasion on the beaches. The number of ships involved on June 6th is stupefying to the imagination. 6,483 vessels were to cross the Channel. So large a fleet that had Calais been chosen, there was not enough sea room for such a fleet where the Channel was at its narrowest. The fleet included 4,000 landing craft and hundreds of specially adapted transport ships and stretched from horizon to horizon in every direction. 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and more than 100 destroyers accompanied the troop transports. On D-Day, these ships engaged the German coastal guns. Germany had but 4 destroyers and 39 motor torpedo boats. Germany's plans to resist invasion were no less detailed. Allied troops were to be met on the beaches by a formidable line of bunkers and coastal guns, the Atlantic Wall. The defenses were organized by Erwin Rommel. He intended any invader to be pinned down on the landing beaches by what were called the static divisions manning the forts, and then hit by a mobile reserve of panzer forces held inland. The Germans stripped the French Maginot Line to build the Atlantic Wall. They laid millions of mines and devised cunning traps and obstacles for landing craft and tanks. The destruction of the coastal defenses by the warships needed daylight. The landing craft needed low water, early in the morning, and the airborne attacks to be made at night needed the full moon. This narrowed the date for D-Day to the 5th, 6th, or 7th of June. Bad weather on the 5th caused the attack to be put back 24 hours. The first forces to land in France did not storm ashore from landing craft. Rather, they arrived in the early hours of the morning of the 6th. Landings were made by over 23,000 parachute and glider troops. The airborne landings were made on the flanks of the invasion zone to protect the beaches from counterattack, whilst the seaborne forces established a bridgehead. The ground forces were delivered to 5 landing beaches. In the east, 2 areas, codenamed Utah and Omaha, were the responsibility of the American forces. The experience of fighting on the 2 beaches was very different. On Utah Beach in the far west, the American forces met perhaps the weakest of German troops. 3 battalions of infantry defending the beaches surrendered without firing barely a shot. The Utah casualties of 197 were the lowest of any on the day of the invasion, in comparison to the 23,000 who came safely ashore. In contrast, the U.S. forces landing on Omaha underwent the very worst of ordeals endured by any troops on June 6th. The U.S. 1st Division came ashore to be met by perhaps the very best troops that the Germans had stationed on the coast. The American soldiers landed on beaches overlooked by cliffs, beaches onto which the Germans were able to direct murderous artillery fire. At Omaha, the swimming tanks were launched too soon, and many foundered in heavy seas. Without the support of these tanks, the infantry on the beach was vulnerable to German infantry in fortified positions. Omaha Beach has been called a disaster and portrayed in fiction as hell. Yet, despite 2,000 deaths on the first day, 34,000 came ashore. British forces attacked to the east on beaches codenamed Gold and Sword. On Juno Beach, the invaders were Canadian. On all 3 landing zones, the German defenders were not the best and were thinly spread. On Sword and Juno, the landings were made easily against little opposition. Before midday on June 6th, the troops were able to join up with the airborne forces, dropped in the rear of the Germans. Overlord was a complex operation, dependent upon every element playing its part. On Gold Beach, a failure of the naval bombardment to suppress all German fortifications and the swimming tanks becoming separated from the infantry meant that the British took heavy casualties. Nevertheless, the story of other beaches was repeated, and despite losses, the invaders were able to land and penetrate into the countryside. An important lesson of the fighting in Italy was the need to maintain a safe and plentiful line of supply. The Allies needed to bring supplies and reinforcements ashore faster than the Germans could move the same over land by road and rail. The Overlord plan involved capturing the French port of Cherbourg, but 2 technologies were developed that enabled the Allies to have a secure supply. Allied civil engineering became as inventive as any work in radar or electronics. A floating harbor system was built out of concrete, codenamed Mulberry and weighing 1.5 million tons. The harbors were floated across the channel in parts and then sunk into place to provide an instant port. Later in the campaign, a flexible oil supply pipe was laid under the sea to deliver a constant flow of fuel. In the 3 weeks following the invasion, the Allies moved more than 800,000 troops across the channel. They joined all the beachheads together and captured the port of Cherbourg. Yet the invasion fell behind schedule. The territory held by the Allies was too small to hold the troops that had been transported. Not enough airfields had been captured. Germans, skilled in anti-tank and defensive warfare, were defending stoutly in the countryside that the French called bocage. Bocage was a medieval field system. Over hundreds of years, thick hedgerows had grown to create deep sunken lanes that provided the Germans with row after row of ready-made deep trench lines, ready-made defenses that could stop tanks. The same roads forced attackers into vulnerable single file, traps with no room for maneuver. The Norman town of Caen was a D-Day objective. 3 weeks after D-Day, it was still German-held. As long as the Nazis held the town, they denied access into the countryside to the south, where the bocage ended, and tanks could maneuver with freedom. It was countryside where airfields could be built. Repeatedly, British and Canadian soldiers threw themselves against Caen, only to be repulsed. British General Montgomery took the ruthless decision to call in the heavy bombers of the Strategic Air Forces. Caen was to be liberated by being bombed into ruins. On July 7th, the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Force systematically demolished Caen. In the next week, the British and American armies fought a series of fierce battles as they pushed the perimeter of the beachhead ever south. Repeatedly, the strategic bombers carpet-bombed German positions. By mid-July, the British had lost more than 1/3 of their total tank force. The American army in the west, following extensive carpet bombing, finally broke through. Their push to the south opened the war and broke the stalemate. The attack that developed turned around the German flank and began to surround their Normandy armies. Hitler had ordered a counterattack in early August that threatened to cut off and surround the Americans. Again, the great secret of the broken German codes came into play. The Allies were ready and waiting, and the Germans were defeated with heavy losses. The tank came of age in World War II. The decisive and devastating attacks of the 1940 German blitzkrieg had demonstrated the potency of armored warfare. Yet, to every invention, there is a reaction. And during the war, powerful techniques and weapons of anti-tank warfare had been devised. The armies fighting in 1944 were far different from those of 1940. No longer did infantry simply flee before advancing tanks, as they had in 1940. Tanks were still an essential ingredient for victory, but needed the support of specialized infantry and mobile artillery to counter the anti-tank regiments of their enemy. The Allies rolled the Germans into an ever tighter pocket around the French town of Falaise. By the middle of August, nearly 500,000 Germans were in an ever more tightly closing trap. Attackers on all sides, to their rear, the obstacle of the River Seine. In what came to be called the Battle of the Falaise Gap, determined action by the SS Hitler Youth Division, a formation of fanatics recruited entirely from the Nazi youth organization, held back the Allies, while 300,000 Germans streamed across the River Seine in a mass escape. All German heavy equipment was lost, 1,300 tanks destroyed, and 200,000 taken prisoner. The original Overlord plan intended the Allies to halt at the Seine, to regroup and reorganize. Instead, Eisenhower decided to capitalize on the victory won and ordered pursuit of the Germans across the open country of France. Hitler had not allowed the preparation of any fallback defensive positions. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to stand and fight. The Germans had to run all the way to Belgium and the Netherlands, even to the borders of Germany itself. Hitler's strategic common sense had not entirely deserted him. Realizing that long lines of supply would weaken the Allies, he commanded all channel ports garrisoned by stay-behind forces to be turned into fortresses and defended to the last. As the Allies neared the borders of the Low Countries in early September, few thought the war would last into 1945. In mid-August 1944, as the Normandy battles were reaching their height, the Allies mounted a second invasion of France on the Riviera. Originally planned to be simultaneous with the Normandy attack, a shortage of landing craft caused the southern invasion to be delayed. Again, there was a massive naval bombardment, and once again, the Allies enjoyed massive air superiority, with 2,000 planes against 200 German. Once initial resistance had been broken, the task of the American and Free French armies was of pursuit and entrapment of the constantly retreating Germans. The Riviera landings threatened to confound Hitler's plan that Paris should be turned into a fortress and battleground. Hitler talked of the French capital as a Stalingrad that would entrap the Allied armies and lead to their annihilation, enduring the same fate as befell the German army at the Russian city a year before. The Riviera landings threatened to surround Paris and instead make the city a trap for the Germans. On August 18th, when it became apparent that the Allied armies were threatening to overwhelm the occupiers, the population of Paris rose in revolt, and fighting broke out on the streets. Eisenhower and Montgomery refused to attack for the sake of attacking. They too saw the lesson of Stalingrad. They ruthlessly believed that liberation could wait, and only military necessity justified attack. As it became clear that the city was fighting to free itself, the Allies were forced to act. Leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle, feared that French communists were attempting a takeover and using the fighting to eliminate their rivals for power in post-war France. The Allies agreed that Free French forces could be released, and on August 23rd, their tanks entered Paris. The German command surrendered. De Gaulle led Allied forces in a march of triumph down the Champs-Élysées. In the complicated timeline of World War II, it's possible that the smallest of human actions might have ended the war and saved many hundreds of thousands of lives. On July 20th, there was an assassination attempt upon Hitler. An officer on Hitler's staff, Klaus von Stauffenberg, a German patriot and war hero, planted a bomb in a meeting attended by the dictator. Fortune was at Hitler's side that day. The meeting changed location to a building that minimized the effect of the blast. Another officer, just wanting to get a closer look at a map, moved the bomb behind a heavy table. Hitler had moved from his usual place in the room. Though 3 died, Hitler survived unhurt and came to believe that his survival was the portent of a greater historical destiny. The group of soldiers and civil servants that had hatched the plot were arrested and sadistically executed. The plotters included Erwin Rommel, who was told to commit suicide or his family would be sent to concentration camps. So the war continued, and Hitler came to believe in miracles. The Allies enjoyed the results of many new technologies, new weapons, and new scientific ways of waging war. This war of invention was not one-sided. Germany was one of the world's leading scientific nations, and the German armed forces enjoyed the use of futuristic weaponry. As the Allied armies fought to establish their grip upon northern France, one of the most famous products of German ingenuity made its debut. On June 13th, the first V-1 flying bomb was launched against London. The V-1 was the prototype cruise missile, a pilotless jet aircraft with automatic guidance that was both ground and air-launched. In the next 2 weeks, nearly 2,500 of these missiles were fired. The flying bombs brought the return of terror to London, worse than the conventional air raid, as attacks were constant. There was no warning, no all clear, no release of tension. As in 1939, children and the vulnerable were evacuated. Some of the missiles were destroyed by anti-aircraft artillery. The fastest of fighters could catch and shoot down the V-1, but this needed courage from the pilot, as the missile exploding frequently destroyed the attacking fighter. Some Spitfire pilots developed a daring technique of flying alongside the V-1, wing to wing, and then placing a wing beneath that of the V-1, tipping the missile into a tumbling dive. In September 1944, mysterious and massive explosions began to occur all over the British capital. A thunderclap of destruction would be followed by a roaring noise that shocked and dazed survivors, likened to that of a speeding train. The explosions were attacks by a new German secret weapon, the V-2. The V-2 was the first ballistic missile. The roar that followed the explosion was the sound of the supersonic missile arriving after the detonation. The government hid the truth. Official news talked of gas explosions. It was 2 months after the first V-2 attack that the government admitted the new weapon existed. There was no defense against the V-2. The missile took less than 3 minutes to fly to Britain. In the Pacific, the gradual process of erosion, of driving back the Japanese island by island, continued. In June 1944, yet more amphibious assaults began, this time in the Marianas Islands. The islands were important to both attacker and defender. The first target, Saipan, was an important Japanese base and within strategic bomber range of the Japanese home islands. The second U.S. objective, Guam, held important supplies of fresh water and was the best natural harbor in the western Pacific. Guam would also be a base for bomber attacks on Japan and a starting point for attacks to recover the Philippine Islands. As so often in these invasions of Pacific islands, the battle on land was preceded by a naval battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea turned into the largest carrier battle of the war. The Japanese were outnumbered in nearly every aspect. The Americans had more than twice the aircraft, had 7 major carriers to Japan's 5, 8 light carriers to Japan's 4. Disparity in quantity was matched by difference in quality. After earlier battles, Japanese crews and pilots never regained the level of training and prowess they had enjoyed earlier in the war, and came to be surpassed in skill by the Americans. The quality of American radar and intelligence was also superior. A great air battle was fought, in which the Americans enjoyed such superiority that the fighting came to be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost nearly 2/3 of their planes. 2 Japanese carriers were lost, 1 to air attack, 1 to a U.S. submarine. With the naval threat destroyed, U.S. Marines had to fight a stern battle to take Saipan. 4,000 Marine casualties were sustained in the first 2 days. An invasion planned to last 3 days stretched to 3 weeks. The terrain of Saipan meant that the U.S. soldiers were forced to make repeated frontal assaults against dug-in Japanese. The defenders fought with fanatical determination. In July, a mass suicide attack by the Japanese saw more than 4,000 Japanese troops killed in one day. Rather than surrender, many Japanese chose to die by their own hand. The delays caused in the taking of Saipan allowed both defenders and attackers of Guam to make full preparations. The Americans opened the assault with the heaviest air and naval bombardments of the Pacific War. More than half the 20,000 Japanese defenders were killed before a single U.S. Marine landed. Although Guam was secured easily, the remnants of the Japanese forces fought on. The last surrendered in 1972. As soon as the Marianas were secure, the U.S. Army Air Force began to turn the islands into bases to attack the Japanese. The raids were to be borne on the wings of a new aircraft, the B-29 Super Fortress. The B-29 was a huge aircraft that could carry a heavier bomb load at greater range than any other aircraft. At first, the planes had flown a tortuous route from bases in China, from where southern Japan was just in range. From November 1944, the Marianas had been turned into air bases. The first raids had been precision high-level attacks upon the Japanese aircraft industry. The raids were inconclusive. In the coming years, these tactics were to be abandoned in favor of mass area attacks against Japan's wooden cities. When ordered to retreat from the Philippine Islands in 1942, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur had famously promised to return. In late 1944, he gathered the forces to fulfill his vow. The Japanese occupation forces in the Philippines were ill-prepared to resist a U.S. invasion. Japan had entered the war in 1941 fully mobilized, with as many men as possible in uniform and industry at near capacity. The United States Navy had imposed a tight blockade around the Japanese islands that severely restricted Japan's capacity to wage war. In contrast, the U.S. Navy enjoyed an embarrassment of riches, able to draw from a well of near-bottomless resources. New battleships, new cruisers, new destroyers streamed from U.S. shipyards. Of the most important ships in the war, the aircraft carriers, no less than 21 new major carriers had been launched since Pearl Harbor, 5 times the equivalent number of Japanese ships. The total number of aircraft the Americans could embark was 3,000, 3 times the Japanese strength. In September 1944, U.S. carrier aircraft destroyed Japanese air forces on the Philippines. In October, MacArthur assembled a fleet of over 700 ships. And following a huge bombardment by battleships, U.S. troops landed on the Philippine island of Leyte. Japan responded with the dispatch of a massive naval force. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, as the battle was to be called, remains the largest naval battle in world history. The Japanese plan was for their aircraft carriers to lure away the American carriers from the landings. Meanwhile, a separate force of Japanese battleships would attack the troop transports and the landed forces. The Battle of Leyte Gulf has been described as the last throw of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Effectively, every major warship that remained to Japan was thrown into the gamble. The last reserves of ships, men, and aircraft were deployed to effect a decisive battle. The battle was, at the same time, a carrier battle, where the air forces of the 2 carrier fleets engaged each other and the enemy carriers. And it was traditional battle fleet engagement, where big gun battleships fought each other in duels of naval artillery. The battle was complex, as the 2 fleets divided their forces and searched for their enemy amongst the scattered Philippine islands. Admirals on both sides lost their nerve then found renewed determination. Massive Japanese battleships, the largest in the world, surprised light U.S. carriers, which fought courageous actions against opponents many times their weight. Destroyers attacked each other or mounted audacious attacks on much heavier ships. Ships were lost by both sides at Leyte, but the fortune of war smiled on America, and the result was a naval triumph which ranks as a victory alongside Trafalgar, as the U.S. Navy destroyed the Japanese. All 4 Japanese carriers and 2 of the battleships were sunk. Japanese Admiral Nishimura went down with his ship. With the naval battle resolved, the fighting on land began. MacArthur spectacularly waded ashore before the newsreel cameras. Further inland, 70,000 Japanese and 15,000 Americans died in the battle to establish a bridgehead. The Japanese failed to throw back the invaders, and a long battle for liberation began. It was at Leyte that a new word passed into the languages of the world: kamikaze. A kamikaze attack was a suicide attack by a pilot crashing his plane loaded with explosive onto an enemy warship. Throughout the war, in rage or fanatical desperation, Japanese aviators had crashed onto their enemies. It was at Leyte that the kamikaze attack became an official tactic. The kamikaze drew on Japanese mythology. The word kamikaze meant divine wind and referred to a miraculous tempest that suddenly arose to destroy a Chinese invasion fleet approaching the defenseless shores of medieval Japan. Kamikaze attacks were not always by aircraft. Japan was to deploy midget submarines, human-piloted torpedoes, and even small manned rockets in suicide attacks. It was the converted fighter aircraft that were to be the most effective. At Leyte, a U.S. carrier and an Australian cruiser were to be the first victims of the divine wind. Hitler had seen the Western invasion as the greatest threat endangering the very heart of the Third Reich. On the Eastern Front, he was prepared to concede territory and transferred troops to the West. On June 22, 1944, as the fighting in the West was at its height, the Soviet Union launched a massive offensive that threatened a general collapse of the German armies in the East. Operation Bagration, named after a hero of the wars against Napoleon, was a huge attack. The numbers told heavily against the Germans. 1.2 million Red Army soldiers against 400,000 Nazis. 5,200 tanks against 900 German machines. 6,000 Soviet aircraft against 1,300 Luftwaffe planes. Hitler was to sacrifice the lives of many thousands of his soldiers by designating Soviet cities as fortresses to be held to the last man. In just 5 weeks, the Russian armies advanced nearly 750 kilometers. By the end of July, the Red Army was 20 kilometers from Poland's capital, Warsaw. As happened at Paris, the population of the Polish capital, with the sound of Russian guns echoing over their city, rose in revolt. The Russians did nothing. They drove attacks to the south, into the Balkans, fighting in Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, and north into the Baltic states. Meanwhile, the Germans systematically destroyed Warsaw and killed more than 200,000 Poles. The Russians were already looking forward to the post-war order. The attacks to the north and south, rather than towards Berlin via Warsaw, were aimed at placing those states within the communist orbit. The Germans were allowed to destroy the Poles to create a space that the Soviets would fill. The war aim of the Allies seems at first simple: the destruction of Nazism, the rolling back of Axis conquests, the liberation of enslaved peoples. Already in late 1944, the signs were there to see that the post-war world would not be a place of simple, straightforward certainty. In October 1944, a British army re-entered Greece. The occupation of Greece had crumbled since the capitulation of the Italians in late 1943. Control had passed to the Germans. Italian weapons had fallen into the hands of Greek resistance fighters, including the Greek communist partisans, the Hellas. The Germans had resorted to ever more harsh reprisals to maintain their rule. In October, the Germans took the decision to abandon Greece, and the Greek government returned with the help of British troops. The British stepped into a minefield of passionate and violent politics. In December, a demonstration in Athens by Greek communists turned into fighting as they were opposed by supporters of the returned government. In days, the British army was fighting Hellas in the streets. In the autumn of 1944, the optimism among the Allies at the end of the Normandy campaign that the war would soon be over was to prove misplaced. The advance across northern France had been so rapid that by early September, the Belgian capital of Brussels had been liberated and the port of Antwerp captured. Supply was crucial to the continuation of the war on into Germany. The capture of a major port facility was a major prize for the Allied armies, but was a prize that was to be squandered. Hitler ordered all Channel ports to be held to the last man. Dunkirk was to hold out to the very end of the war. The capture of Antwerp left a large German force to the west, controlling the approaches to the port, rendering it unusable. The Allies failed to clear those troops, who mined and dominated the river with artillery. The Allies failed to prevent the Germans from gathering their scattered forces and reorganizing. The Allies ignored intelligence that revealed their plan to fight a major battle against the Allied supply lines. No action was taken because of the wave of feverish optimism that the war could be ended quickly. The will of the Allied commanders was focused elsewhere. The distraction was the operation planned by British General Bernard Montgomery to seize a crossing of the River Rhine by airborne attack, drive forward to the captured crossings with armored forces, then invade Germany and end the war before Christmas. This was the famous Arnhem attack, the bridge too far. In mid-September, American airborne forces seized bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven, attacks that went smoothly and with success. The British 1st Airborne Division descended upon Arnhem, deep in the Netherlands. The British forces, though, were dropped not near enough to their targets. They landed upon 2 SS Panzer divisions that were re-equipping, and the British plans for the operation were captured. British forces found themselves pinned down, and, under increasing pressure, failed to capture the bridge. The action by ground forces to link up and relieve the paratroopers and glider troops was met by heavy German resistance and ground to a halt. After a week, the British were forced to admit defeat. What troops could be saved were, but 6,000 were taken prisoner and more than 1,000 killed. Arnhem was not a decisive defeat in itself, but the operation took Allied attention away from the situation at Antwerp. The failure to mount a simple mopping-up operation and make Antwerp port operational was to lengthen the war. After the chaos at Arnhem, the Allies had to fight a series of difficult actions against the German forces that had taken the opportunity to reinforce and prepare. The battles were fought across the flooded and waterlogged Low Countries. Attacks had to be made by commandos with amphibious vehicles. Canadian armies had to make repeated charges across open ground against prepared German artillery, surrounded by dense infantry defenses. Pillboxes and strongpoints had to be taken one by one in close infantry action. The towns of the region had to be cleared in fierce street fighting. In the midst of all this, engineers and naval minesweepers had to clear the mines and booby traps with which the Germans had filled the waterways. It was not until late November, more than 80 days after its capture, that Antwerp was brought into action. A desire for victory, of an end to the fighting, only condemned Europe to enter another year of war. Next time on World War II, The Complete History, in a desperate attempt to save Germany, Hitler attempts to repeat the triumph of 1940 with attacks through Belgium in what history comes to call the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans collapse in the east, and Russian armies enter Germany. They encounter Auschwitz, and the full evil of Nazism becomes known to the world. The last act of a dying Franklin Roosevelt is